Okay, it's Mike. We're wrestle riding with Mike. The phone camera is on the apparatus, and we're here to discuss when you think a wrestler should have been a world champion, comma, why he or she was not, period. So let's discuss why, when you think a wrestler should have been a world champion, why he or she was not. I forgot the comma that time, but we'll move forward. So a lot of people always, and I got into this schmaltz with a nice enough fellow in one of the wrestling talk, conversations there on the old internet. And it was basically, he was making a point that in kind of that turn of the decade, 89 into 90, WCW/NWA. Technically, it should have been called WCW, but they were still calling it NWA after the Turner acquisition. They really didn't start calling it WCW until early 91, but they should have been calling it WCW since late 88 when Turner acquired, if that's the word, acquired WCW or NWA, whatever the fuck. Moving the fuck on. Why do you think that this person should have been world champion? Or first of all, let's take the point. A lot of wrestling fans, this guy, he mentioned Steve Dr. Death Williams should have been a world champion. And he mentioned the following tag teams, I believe. The Fantastics, the Wild-Eyed Southern Boys, being Tracy Smothers and one of the Armstrongs, I think Scott Armstrong, or maybe it was Steve. I get those mixed up. I get my Steves and Scott Armstrongs mixed up. And the Fantastics, or the Lightning Express, one or the other. But anyway, this gentleman, who was a gentleman, thought these guys should have all been world champions. And we see this a lot where you say, well, Roddy Piper, that's the consummate one. It used to be WaHoo McDaniel, then it became Roddy Piper. Should have been a world champion. Paul Orndorff, many people claim, could have had a world title run. And so we always say that, but the neg of that, the reverse, the flip side, if you would, in public is, if such and such were to be world champion, or a women's world champion, or a tag team champion, if any of these people were to have been world champion, you're trying to offer a scenario that makes them world champion, but then you've got to take away time on a championship tree or a lineage from someone else or some other thing. Let's take Piper, for example. A lot of people will, and I can go along with it too. You say Piper should have been world champion. Well, when? When would he have held this? And you can say, well, the Rock and Wrestling era. People just vaguely throw that out there. Okay, are you talking pre-WrestleMania, post-WrestleMania? Now, if I were to go, I'm going to play both sides of the argument and say you could have made Piper world champion going into WrestleMania 1, I guess. You could have had Piper win the title at War to settle the score, and then had the WrestleMania main event been Piper versus Hogan for the title. Okay, if you want to play that game, but what are you going to do with Mr. T? I mean, are you going to just throw him in the corner? It doesn't have the pizzazz. If Mr. T was just a corner man for Hulk Hogan, and the main event of WrestleMania 1 was, say, Roddy Piper versus Hulk Hogan, or even you could go Hulk Hogan versus Paul Orndorff if you want, for the title, and you could have either Hogan defending against one of those guys, or one of those guys having a brief title reign in order for Hogan to get it for a second run. My point is that it's not the same thing, because the whole big hook of WrestleMania 1 was that Mr. T was wrestling. That's the whole fucking point of the goddamn thing. So throw that out the window. Then you say, well, Piper should have had it at some point. Well, when? Exactly when? If you could say that Piper could have had it at some point in Hogan's title reign, but by the time we got to WrestleMania 3, Piper was a full-on babyface, and he was basically retiring for a couple of years. So you have basically a very short window. You have Piper pretty much came into WWF around the same time as Hogan. The night that for Hogan's second WWF run, you can watch that whole Madison Square Garden show online and find that Piper was, I believe, on the undercard as a manager for Paul Orndorff or some such thing, on that undercard or in that time zone or whatever the fuck. And my point is, when exactly are you saying that Roddy Piper should have been world champion? If you're going to make that statement, which everybody does, Roddy Piper should have been world champion, when would you have taken time away from Hogan? Okay, or maybe Savage. Are you saying that But Savage won his title at WrestleMania 4, and Piper wasn't there. Piper came back for WrestleMania 5, but just in a talking role. And eventually by 6, he was wrestling, but he was upper mid-card. He got the Intercontinental title at WrestleMania 8, and if you really wanted to push this Piper thing, you'd say he could have beaten Flair, and you could have had Flair Piper for the world title. But the problem is, or the situation is, they had already done Flair Piper feud without the title. So my opinion is Roddy was great. He didn't really need the belt. That old cliche, the only belt that he needs is to pick up his pants. And Roddy was just not, him and the WWF world title were just not meant to be. Now, if you want to say, well, he could have the world WCW title, he could have the NWA title. If anything, you could make a case that Piper could have been NWA world champion for a hiccup or two, or as a spot show champion or some such thing, before he went to the WWF in the first place in late 83, early 84. But once again, who would you have taken time away from? Maybe could he have been in that spot that Tommy Rich got? I don't know if he'd want that spot. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Or what? I mean, I don't know what to tell you, okay? But the point is, we see this trend. You have to go and you have to say, well, who are you taking time away from? Well, if you want to say Piper 96, WWF, he's feuding with Goldust, are you going to give him the title then? Well, Shawn was the champion. They're trying to make Shawn something. I mean, now, maybe. I mean, if you want. But the point is, to see the pattern we're developing here, is you can't just say, well, such and such should have been world champion. Well, who are you taking time away from? If you took any, name a million guys, Bundy, King Kong Bundy, okay? All these guys, DiBiase in the 88, or Nikolai Volkov, or whoever you want, and say they should have been world champion. You're taking away from Hogan's 4-year run, but the whole thing about Hogan's 4-year run is that it was building up to WrestleMania 3 against Andre, and then to Hogan's, big loss on February 5th, 1988 on NBC to Andre, which was a big deal at the time. And if Hogan had like a couple of hiccup title losses in the mix, like, oh, he lost it for 6 months to Piper, or he lost it for a few months to such and such, then it wouldn't have been the same prestige, okay? And that elevated, the belt to that audience, to those fans. They needed that long run of Hogan. Who else? This guy said Steve Dr. Death Williams. Now, I can go along with that in saying that in 88, basically, if you say that Flair, which he did, won the title at Starrcade 87 over Ronnie Garvin, if anything, you could say that they could have brought it, if everyone pisses on the Ronnie Garvin title reign for various reasons, which is okay, they can do that. But if you want to say Steve Williams should have been the world champion instead of Ronnie Garvin, that might have been interesting. If Steve Williams had beaten Flair in, September, October of 87 in some type of special primetime Clash of Champions, UWF champion versus NWA champion, Steve Williams gets a belt, unifies UWF and NWA, puts over the UWF a little bit, and then Flair gets the title back from, Steve Dr. Death Williams at Starrcade 87. I can go along with that. However, that's not the way it was meant to be. They always seem to be building to a Flair-Williams match, champion versus champion. They didn't do it. They just fizzled out. The UWF title just kind of disintegrated into so much gold dust, so to speak. So on and so forth, so on and so forth. Because Flair did have a couple of lengthy title reigns. The Starrcade 87 title reign all the way into February of 89 Chi-Town Rumble. I could see that, 14 or 16 months, that reign could have been kind of interrupted by a Steve Williams title reign. I wouldn't have been terribly offended. So I'll give the guy that. As far as these tag teams that the guy mentioned, this is for really old school fans, but basic gist, Lightning Express were like UWF tag team champions, the dying days of the UWF, Brad Armstrong and Tim Horner. Wild-Eyed Southern Boys, I did like them. And the third team, who did he say? Whoever the fuck, the Fantastics. They all kind of bounced around with the U.S. Tag Team title. Back in the day, you had something called the U.S. Tag Team title, which was kind of the Intercontinental title for the NWA World Championship of Tag Teams. And so some of these teams were better served in that division. And there was a lot of crossover. You had teams like the Steiners and the Midnight Express, different variations of the Midnight. I used to say Midnights until Cornette got that in my fucking head. The Midnight with the singular T. I don't like it, but the Midnights. You had a whole deal with that, but it was one of those deals where, for whatever the fuck reason, the NWA World Tag Team Championship seemed either for like heavier teams, meaning physically heavier, like Doom or the Steiners or the Road Warriors, or like top of the charts, Tully and Arn, Midnight Express. For the tag teams like the Wild Eyed Southern Boys or the Young Pistols or whoever the fuck, Zank and Pillman, rest in peace, Tom Zank, moment of silence. Those guys had the U.S. Tag Team title. To say that every single team that was great, look, I can make a whole case of the Killer Bees in the WWF, going back to there, 86, okay? But if you're going to say that every single team that was great should have been world champion, well, that's not the case, because obviously, there are football teams, the Patriots, 2007, undefeated regular season. What do? Win 2 playoff games and then go to the Super Bowl and lost. You have to have great teams or great singles that are great, that are awesome, that are epic. They talk about the fucking baseball team, the Red Sox of the 60s, some year, 67 or some such thing, where they were awesome and great. Everyone loved them, and they didn't win the World Series. You have to have great contenders that do not win to bring luster to the championship, okay? Not even about the champions, but you have to have great competitors. Dan Marino, if you want, this is going all over the fucking place. I'm going to bring it in back to wrestling in a second. Dan Marino, you can argue, is the greatest quarterback of all time if you want to go to regular season stats. But if you say he didn't win the championship, the NFL World Super Bowl, and he doesn't deserve to be called the greatest of all time, then you would say, why not? Well, someone else has to, because that's the person who had the championship. Now we go back to wrestling, because football's a different issue. But going back to wrestling, who else do they say? WaHoo McDaniel. For fucking 15 or 20 years, WaHoo McDaniel's gimmick, more or less, is the greatest wrestler to never win a world title. If he won a world title, it would kind of kill his gimmick. So we can't get too upset about this stuff. In the big picture, not to say that it's all fantasy world, it's all horseplay and bullshit. It's not, but it's just to say, don't get too worked up about it, folks, or say this, if WaHoo was world champion, what would you have done? Would you have taken it away from Harley for one of those 7 reigns? Maybe, that's fine. Would you have thrown WaHoo in the mix and had somehow fight with Dusty or Baba? I don't know if he could have gone, had a match with Baba. I don't know if that would have worked. It would have been an oddball pairing. I'm talking about WaHoo, McDaniel in the early 80s. You could have said, Sergeant Slaughter should have been world champion as a good guy in 1984. Well, that was Hogan's time. So the whole point, getting back to the original point, if you're going to say someone should have been world champion, please finish your goddamn thought process and tell me who the fuck should have not been the world champion in order to make your person the world champion at that time. You're going to say, I'm trying to think of another example. I'll say my own example. The Killer Bees should have been world champion, tag team. Well, then what? Are you going to say that they should have been and the Bulldogs shouldn't? Or that the fucking Bees should have beaten Barry Windham and Mike Rotundo in some type of double face match? Or that the Dream Team of Valentine and Beefcake shouldn't have had a nice 9 or 10th month title reign? What exactly are you trying to do here? Now, this is where I'm going to flip back to the other side of the coin, because I can do that. I would say that Damien Sandow, yes, I will go there. 2011 era, 2012, they could have done something with this guy. Could he have been an Intercontinental Champion as the Mizdow? Could he have they let him win the Money in the Bank. Could he have beaten Cena? Could we have taken a couple of these title reigns off of Cena and letting someone else do it? I'd say yes. So I'd say, this is where it's going to get a little controversial, folks, but I'm going to take both sides of this fence here. I'm going to say in the 80s and most of the 90s, I would say we should have kept what we had. But moving forth into that 2011 PG era, yeah, you could have taken quite like 6 or 7 of those Cena reigns. You could have spread the wealth and seen what happened with a guy like Sandow. Or, given Miz a couple of more runs, or 2 or 3 runs for the Miz. See if he had anything in there. Who else? Okay, we talked about me and this fellow on the inundation of European and Intercontinental title reigns. Were just spread around like so much fertilizer. My point in bringing that up was to this fellow that the championships, especially the Intercontinental, in that time frame of the Attitude Era, basically the Intercontinental and the fucking European title were tossed around like so much salad, because it seemed like, the Road Dogg's having an Intercontinental title reign. Let's put the Intercontinental title on Jeff Jarrett this week. Let's give Billy Gunn the European title for no reason, because Texas is part of Europe now. There was so many title reigns, and the hardcore title was just really the epitome of that, with my buddy or Raven, 27 title reigns of hardcore, but it really became kind of I don't want to say a joke, but it became like, now we were just having 6 or 7 title switches on WrestleMania for the hardcore title just to get guys a paycheck or get them some FaceTime, which is nice. But the point is, the promoters think that giving these belts to these guys and somehow establishes them or gets them a little FaceTime or a little belt time or puts a little checkbox in their resume. But what it does, it diminishes the titles. So if you're going to hand out all these championships, and this is the problem of that Attitude Era, was all the titles were being thrown around left and right, that the titles don't mean much anymore if they're just being tossed around. I mean, I remember going to Nitro and Kevin Nash literally just saying, "Here, Ric Flair, here's the title." Giving Ric Flair the championship belt that Flair didn't even beat a guy for. He just gave it to him because of something with Jeff Jarrett or some such thing. So the point is, folks, when you say that someone should have been the world champion, you can say that, and that's a nice thing to say. You can say, Jake the Snake should have been a world champion. Well, okay, once again, who would you have him taking the place of? Hogan? Macho? Ultimate Warrior? I mean, choose your poison here, but at least think about it. I mean, if you're going to say, well, we could have given Jake the Snake a world title run instead of the Ultimate Warrior. Well, then are you going to somehow have Jake the Snake fight Sergeant Slaughter and Savage hit Snake with the fucking thing in his head? You can't just, it's like a thread, like a butterfly effect. You can't just, in your own mind, justify saying these things. Just take a second step and say, if you want to play the game, go ahead. But say, how would you have really reconstructed history and past events in order to make all these things happen? That's how far deep you have to go. Should have been. Well, he didn't. Okay? For the women, Candice Michelle comes to mind. And I'm not picking on Candice or Kelly, very gorgeous women, and they seem determined and dedicated and hardworking. But for some of those, very aesthetically pleasing, attractive women that were given the women's championship or the Divas title in that era, with the exception of Maurice, I'd say, I don't think in history books people are going to remember people, like Candice Michelle and Kelly as hard. I mean, Candice Michelle did learn how to hold their own in a match, but they were really meant as Mr. McMahon, Vince McMahon, eye candy fodder for him to put his hands on. Okay, let's just be honest. And to say that they were definitely a part of the show, they definitely contributed, but were they up to the level of a few years before them, Trish Stratus and, a Mickie James or Alita or Victoria, for crying out loud? I mean, she was great. Were those women, or Jazz, who was tough as nails, or Jacqueline going back, or even after them, the next era where you kind of had Beth Phoenix as kind of a segue. Maurice was great, and then you had women, the Bellas never did too much for me. That really long reign of Nikki Bella didn't do much for me. But then you're talking about, all these new women, Charlotte, Sasha, who's great. I'm not a big Bayley fan. I'm just not. But the point is, if you're going to say things like that about the women's league, I don't know, because it seemed like every woman got the title at one point or another. I think even Alicia Fox got it. And then you have 2 titles. So that we can go into all these different things. Do they need 2 championships? Probably not for every single division. Do you need 2 tag team, 2 women's, and 2 world, and 2 secondary? That's a lot. Okay, now we've got 8 titles. I just ripped them off in 30. I mean, it's too many. But the point is, when you say such and such should have been world champion, I'm trying to think if I forgot anybody, but I don't think I mean, Magnum TA, once again. Okay, well, there you have something that's really tough to talk about because of the car accident. Would Magnum have been world champion? Yes, most likely he would have gotten it at some point. But to say that he should have been before the accident, I don't think you can make that case very hard, because the whole point was, now he was kind of one of the boys, in the mix. He was established. He was a former U.S. champion. He didn't have that belt around his waist going into early 87. Who knows what would have happened? Point is, I get it when people get upset or they get emotional and passionate and say such and such should have been world champion. But I think I've clearly illustrated that that is a conversation that you have to finish and complete and fully think about if you really want to be considered a wrestling historian. If you just want to be another asshole on fucking Facebook, not that saying that anybody is, but I'm just saying if you want to be another person who spouts off opinions, and I got into something last week with some guy was saying whatever about everything. I said, don't say whatever. That's something that, no offense to teenage girls, but teenage girls say whatever when they're talking back to their parents. Think about what you're saying. Have a conversation. Okay? For the guy that was saying Steve Dr. Death, I can go along with that. The tag teams, I don't know if I'd go along with those, but the Dr. Death, I could go along with that. But just, I hope I've illustrated thoroughly everything that makes sense in the world. It's your buddy Mike Messier. Plenty of life rants, wrestling rants, blah, blah, blah. And, this is what we do. We discuss things in an intelligent manner. There's the American flag flying high. And I hope you're all having a damn fine day.